In the beginning there is a hush, the kind that falls across a palace at dawn, when servants move like shadows and the day has not yet been claimed by noise. That hush held the first breath of a child who would one day be called Ashoka, though at that moment he was just another son of Bindusara of the Maurya dynasty, a living link to the empire that Chandragupta had carved out with iron will and patient calculation. The palace was a stage of soft power and sharper threats, where learning and ruthlessness shared the same corridors, and the infant who would become Ashoka was entrusted to wet nurses, tutors, and the ever-watchful eyes of courtiers who measured worth in lineage and potential. The story begins in silence, with a baby who will one day shape an empire. Subscribe and write in the comments what stays with you more, the peace of that morning or the shadow of the throne waiting for him. He grew inside a world that was both vast and claustrophobic, a network of networks where trade routes braided together and emissaries arrived with silks and news from distant courts. From his earliest memories he knew the cadence of command, the way his father's footsteps announced decisions, the way ministers moved like pieces on a board, and the look in a general's eye when he contemplated cannonades that did not yet exist but were imagined in the language of conquest. He learned languages and arithmetic, the histories that justified rule, and the weight of expectations that accompany royal blood. Daily life alternated between the mundane comforts of princely privilege and the ever-present education and the calculus of power. By adolescence, the boy who would be Ashoka had taken on a reputation, one shaped as much by rumor as by reality. He was fierce, quick-tempered, and ambitious, qualities admired and feared in equal measure at court. The palace gossip that shaped his image told of secret contests and rivalries among princes, of half-brothers whose names were whispered with either affection or a wishful edge. Ambition is a living thing in a royal house. It roots itself in the soil of opportunity and blooms in the light of a throne that might be had. The world beyond the palace taught him different lessons. He watched merchants bargain in the bazaars, observed soldiers as they drilled in the courtyard, and listened when envoys spoke of lands with strange gods and stranger customs. Those tales were more than idle entertainment. They were the threads by which an empire stitched itself to the rest of the world. In every story of a distant king or a conquered city, the young prince found mirrors to his own ambitions and warnings wrapped in other people's misfortunes. Court life could be a maze of alliances and betrayals where the most mundane favors could become dossiers in the hands of enemies. Ashoka became adept at reading faces, at parsing silences, at knowing when to offer a smile and when to tighten his jaw. He cultivated friends among soldiers and servants alike, knowing that loyalty rarely flowed only upward. It was forged in the small republics that existed inside palaces, among those who swept the floors, fed the horses, or polished the armor. Such connections would one day prove more valuable than gold. Ambition needs fuel, and one of its steady sources is the education of power. Ashoka studied warfare with generals who had been taught in the shadow of Alexander's successor's lingering influence, and he learned statecraft from ministers who measured success in taxes and tribute. He listened to debates on law and order, on the responsibilities of rulers to their subjects, and on the brittle ethics that often justified violence in the name of unity. Each lecture, each confrontation, sharpened his mind and hardened his resolve, giving form to desires that were equal parts idealism and cunning. There were also softer disciplines that molded him: poetry, philosophy, and the religious diversity of an empire that stretched wide. The Mauryan court drew Brahmins, Jains, and ascetics of many stripes, and their ideas brushed against one another in ways that would seep into the consciousness of any thoughtful prince. He learned the hymns chanted in temple chambers and the quiet mantras of those who sought truth in solitude. Those teachings would later be invoked in decisions both gentle and severe, for rulers are shaped as much by the introspective longings of faith as by the blunt calculus of statecraft. Nevertheless, ambition is seldom a solitary flame. Ashoka's ascent was built on networks, brothers, generals, and courtiers whose loyalties could be counted in coin or favor. He cultivated relationships with key military commanders, men who controlled the lives of soldiers and the outcomes of battles. Through them he began to map the landscape not in contours of hills and rivers but in terms of influence and supply lines, of strongholds that anchored imperial reach and of weak spots where rebels might stir. Every fortress, every gateway, was a decision waiting to be seized. Rivalries among siblings are an ancient kind of history in royal houses. Ashoka did not rise untouched by them. There was tension over succession, whispers about who would inherit the crown, and maneuvering in shadowed alcoves that sometimes spilled into open confrontation. These familial struggles were not merely dynastic theater, they were existential contests, where the wrong alliance could cost life and legacy. He watched and learned which alliances solidified power and which were snake pits veiled as embraces. As the prince matured, his temperament shaped the strategies he favored. He was not solely a man of bloodlust nor entirely a scholar of peace. He balanced an appetite for expansion with a capacity for governance. There were plans drafted in candlelight, layered with contingencies, and there were decisions about where to send legions and where to hush a riot with gold and counsel instead of steel. He began to understand the real measure of rule, not only the size of land under a king's banner but the ease with which that land could be held. And then, as in many such stories, fate intervened in the form of opportunity and chaos. Provinces simmered with discontent, local governors grew too comfortable, and distant regions whispered of secession. The empire Chandragupta had founded was vast but not monolithic, and the centrifugal forces of local identity and geography tugged at its seams. For a prince gifted with ambition, moments like these were openings. They were invitations to prove worth by reweaving the threads of unity. Ashoka's military acumen was put to the test in skirmishes that were at once practical and symbolic. Early campaigns refined not just tactics but reputation. He learned the utility of speed, the importance of supply chains, and the moral calculus that accompanied slaughter when it was deemed necessary. Those on whom he relied expected victories and respected the clarity of command. Winning consolidated his authority, while each victory also carried the heavier burden of responsibility for those left in its wake. Yet for all his successes, Ashoka was not untouched by the darker arts of court. Poison, both literal and metaphorical, coursed through the politics of succession. Allies betrayed one another, promises twisted into accusations. He navigated such storms with a mixture of cunning and ferocity, sometimes striking before an enemy could finish a thought and sometimes stepping back to recast a plan. Such behavior won him both fear and grudging admiration, and while it secured paths forward, it also sowed seeds of paranoia that accompanied rulers throughout history. Ambition often becomes its own narrative, a voice that tells of destiny and mocks hesitation. It can be fed by whispers of destiny and the clear, inexorable march of change. Ashoka internalized a narrative of expansion and consolidation, imagining an empire that could bind diverse peoples under a common administration while allowing local customs to flourish. He spoke of roads and trade and the law. He measured his rule not just in coin but in the stability of borders and the deference of governors. One of the defining chapters of his rise involved campaigns that tested the empire's limits in both geography and morality. There were provinces that lay separated by rivers and mountain passes, regions that clung to old loyalties and new gods. These were the kinds of places where empires are either built or broken. Ashoka approached these frontier challenges with the mix of force and diplomacy he had cultivated, sending envoys with gifts and generals with banners, and waiting for the balance to tip in his favor. Kalinga, a land down the eastern seaboard, was one such crucible. Rich in resources and fiercely independent, it presented a prize not only of commerce but of strategic control. a link between the heartland of the Mauryan realm and maritime routes that promised wealth and influence. For Ashoka and his commanders, Kalinga was a test of mettle and doctrine. It was a place where plans were drawn with maps and carried out with blood, where ambition collided with the stubborn reality of resistance. The campaign against Kalinga was not a single, simple sweep. It unfolded through maneuvers that involved river crossings, sieges of fortified towns, and the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and elephants. Ashoka commanded with the authority he had earned, and the conflict escalated in ways that revealed both his tactical capacities and the brutal costs of imperial expansion. Reports from the field spoke of towns razed and people uprooted, of columns of captives led away beneath banners that fluttered indifferent to individual suffering. News traveled back to the capital with a mixture of triumph and unease. Victories were celebrated with proclamations and ceremonial displays, yet descriptions of the casualties and the cries of the bereaved could not be entirely shielded from the ruler's conscience. It is in those moments that the private and public spheres of power intersect in painful clarity. The state demands obedience, and the ruler must reconcile the demand with the echoes of destruction his orders have caused. Ashoka stood on the cusp of empire, watching victories ripple outward and wondering at their meaning. The Kalinga episode became a crucible not only for the empire but also for Ashoka himself. In the silence after the smoldering battles, when the dust settled and the roar of triumph was replaced by the groans of the wounded, the human scale of his decisions became unmistakable. Soldiers who had obeyed commands returned with faces hollowed by what they had seen, and the marketplaces that once thrummed with life were speckled with the dust of emptiness. Those tangible outcomes forced a reckoning. Victory could be achieved by blood, but at what moral and political cost? It has often been said that rulers are tempered by sorrow, and in Ashoka's case the sorrow was not an abstraction. Accounts of the time, amplified by later traditions, suggest a ruler moved by the suffering that followed his campaigns. He walked through conquered lands and saw the displacement and the scars etched into homes and hearts. These sights altered the texture of his ambition, bending it rather than extinguishing it, pushing him toward a new set of priorities that would shape the years to come. This was not an overnight transformation from conqueror to philosopher-king. Change, especially of such magnitude, unfurls slowly and unevenly. Ashoka continued to administer, to secure borders, and to appoint governors who would maintain order. He remained a ruler who recognized the necessity of strength, but he began to temper force with the beginnings of a more humane approach, introducing measures that reflected a growing concern for the welfare of people within his realm. The seeds of this altered governance appeared in actions that combined practical administration with moral intention. He ordered improved roads and planted shade trees along routes to aid travelers, actions that were both practical and symbolic of a new purpose, to ease the burdens of daily life and to connect the empire in ways that brought commerce and communication. Such infrastructural projects signaled an understanding that the legitimacy of rule lies not solely in war but in the capacity to help citizens move, trade, and live with security. Ashoka's reforms extended into legal and social spheres. He sought to standardize measures and weights, to curtail exploitative practices, and to support institutions that provided relief to those in need. These policies were practical steps toward stabilizing an empire and retaining loyalty, but they also reflected an emerging philosophy about the responsibilities of the powerful. The balance between justice and authority became central to his conception of governance. Religion and moral instruction became tools of statecraft in his hands, not only for internal cohesion but for the personal reconciliation of a ruler who had seen war's ravages. He encouraged the teachings of different faiths and sought to create an atmosphere of toleration, recognizing that a stable empire required respect for its many beliefs. This approach was pragmatic, yet also sincere, He genuinely wrestled with the idea that power might be wielded in ways that minimized suffering and cultivated virtue among his subjects. Yet ambition never disappears simply because a ruler grows more reflective. Instead, it transforms and finds new outlets. Ashoka's new ambitions were still grand, but they were aimed at different prizes: unity through welfare, permanence through law, and renown through benevolence. He sent emissaries to foreign courts, not merely to boast of conquests, but to exchange ideas and foster friendships that would make the world around his empire more secure and receptive to trade. Diplomacy became a complement to force, a renewed instrument in his growing repertoire. This duality, of strength balanced by compassion, created tensions within the court and the army. Commanders who had known success in battle sometimes chafed at the new priorities, fearing that softness would invite rebellion. Courtiers debated the costs and benefits of Ashoka's softer measures. These debates were not merely theoretical, they had implications for budgets, for supply lines, and for the very identity of the state he ruled. To manage such tensions, Ashoka increasingly turned to communication as a form of governance. He commissioned edicts carved in stone and pillars set in public places, messages designed to reach men and women who might never see his court. Those proclamations were unusual for their time. They spoke not only of laws and punishments but of ethical precepts, care for prisoners, and the treatment of animals. The language was at once administrative and moral, aimed at shaping the conduct of officials and citizens alike. The edicts were practical tools, but they also embodied a certain theatricality, a way of presenting a ruler who had seen the consequences of war and chosen to articulate a different vision. In them, Ashoka attempted to translate personal remorse and public ambition into a governance ethic that could outlast him. He sought to reconfigure loyalty not solely as fear of punishment but as respect for policies that brought tangible benefits and moral clarity to daily life. Behind these public gestures, he traveled the empire and engaged with the realities of rule firsthand. He visited hospitals and wells, observed markets, and spoke to elders and officials in ways that allowed him to collect information unfiltered by layers of bureaucracy. Such travels informed his edicts and reforms. They were not merely symbolic tours but methods of precise governance. A ruler who knows the texture of his subjects' lives is better equipped to shape policies that address real needs. The complexity of the empire demanded that Ashoka also nurture administrative sophistication. He refined tax systems, appointed messengers and inspectors, and created bureaucratic pathways that could implement his vision at local levels. Administration is an art of translation. Great ideas must become procedures, laws must be enacted, and decrees must be enforced in ways that adapt to local conditions. Achieving that required patience, oversight, and a managerial mindset that balanced central control with pragmatic decentralization. His relationship with religion deepened in a way that intertwined personal conviction and political expediency. He embraced a path that many later associated with Buddhism, but his patronage extended broadly, supporting monks and teachers from multiple traditions. This inclusive stance had immediate political advantages in a multi-faith empire, but it also reflected a genuine engagement with ethical concerns about suffering, compassion, and nonviolence. His patronage of religious institutions was at once an offering and a strategy to foster moral cohesion. Ashoka's engagement with the moral languages of his time did not make him a passive figure. He continued to assert imperial authority where needed, to protect trade routes, and to repel invasions. He maintained a standing army and kept watch on borders that could be breached by opportunists or restive peoples. His rule was thus characterized by a continual negotiation between the realities of power and the aspirations of conscience. He also cultivated an international posture, sending envoys across seas and deserts to distant rulers. These missions extended his influence and created networks of knowledge that benefited commerce and diplomacy. They were also instruments of soft power, projecting an image of a ruler not only formidable on the battlefield but wise enough to engage in philosophical exchange and moral dialogue. This combination of martial reputation and cultural reach enhanced the prestige of his reign far beyond the immediate borders of his empire. Over time, his policies began to alter the social fabric in subtle but important ways. Where violence had once been a dominant answer, negotiation and welfare programs found more room to operate. Public health initiatives and the support of religious charities alleviated some of the harshness that had marked earlier expansion. Social life adapted, markets grew more secure, monasteries multiplied as centers of learning and relief, and the idea of rulerly responsibility became more concrete in the daily lives of many subjects. This transformation, however, was uneven and contested. There were regions and elites resistant to change, and the constant work of governance meant addressing these pockets of resistance without allowing them to ignite broader unrest. Some governors acted harshly, clinging to older logics of coercion. At the same time, parts of the populace embraced reforms that promised relief from excessive taxation and harsher punishments. The tapestry of the empire changed thread by thread rather than by sweeping, uniform motion. Ashoka's personal life reflected the tensions of his public choices. In private, he wrestled with the consequences of decisions that affected millions. He maintained a presence in the palace's private rooms and the corridors of power, but he also spent time in solitude, consulting with sages, physicians, and thinkers who probed the ethical dimensions of rule. Such retreats were not escapes but forms of governance. Contemplative practice became a laboratory where policy and philosophy were tested against each other. Throughout his reign, he dealt with succession concerns and the perennial anxiety every ruler faces: what happens when the current holder of power is gone? He sought to build institutions that would outlast him, to create administrative norms and legal frameworks capable of providing continuity. Still, the human element, ambition in others, could never be entirely legislated away. He attempted to balance the distribution of power among trusted ministers and kin to reduce rivalry, knowing that absolute control breeds its own instability. In assessing Ashoka's rise, one must also look at the cultural shifts that his reign catalyzed. Paintings, inscriptions, and the proliferation of moral discourse signaled a society increasingly engaged in questions about right action and governance. Artisans found patronage in public works, and scholars whose ideas resonated with the new climate gained audiences among both commoners and elites. The cultural life of the empire flourished under a state that invested not only in fortifications but also in intellectual and spiritual infrastructure. Yet while culture and welfare grew, the mechanisms of coercion were never fully dismantled. The state retained its capacity for force should rebellions or incursions demand it. Ashoka's legacy is complicated by the continued need for a military and the realities of maintaining order across vast distances. He held a sword that he used sparingly but with clear understanding of its necessity. Power retained its paradoxical nature. It could be used to protect or to punish, to unify or to dominate. As his reign matured, Ashoka increasingly framed his rule in language intended to endure, to become part of the moral vocabulary of governance. He crafted edicts to be read by those who lived centuries after his time, messages intended to teach humility, compassion, and responsibility. Whether those words were regarded as sincere confession or political theater depended on the observer, but their existence signaled a ruler deeply invested in the meaning of his actions over and above the immediate calculus of power. Historians and storytellers would later distill his life into a narrative of conversion, of a warrior king transformed by remorse into a patron of peace. But such neat arcs obscure the texture of actual governance, which is rarely linear or entirely principled. Ashoka's transformation was real, yes, but interwoven with persistent political necessities and moments of contradiction. He was complex, martial and merciful, strategic and introspective, a ruler whose policies bore witness to the messy middle ground where idealism meets the demands of statecraft. Towards the latter years of his rule, he continued to refine the balance he had sought for decades. He appointed officials he trusted, patronized institutions that supported the vulnerable, and maintained a diplomatic posture that extended his influence without spilling blood unnecessarily. The empire, vast as it was, displayed a surprising degree of cohesion, a product not only of military presence but of cultural policies and administrative competence. His attempts to embed ethical norms into the fabric of governance left an imprint visible in inscriptions and public memory. Yet the question of legacy is never decided in a lifetime. The structures and practices Ashoka created would outlast him in varying degrees, subject to the interpretations and ambitions of those who followed. Dynasties rise and fall, reforms are revised, and memories are repurposed by later generations seeking legitimacy. Still, the contours of his reign, particularly the pivot from relentless expansion to welfare-oriented rule, remained a subject of reference and debate in the centuries that followed, a benchmark against which others measured their own rule. In private, he aged under the weight of decisions that changed both his nation and himself. He mourned the lives that had been lost under his command and sought to redeem that past through policies that emphasized care and moral instruction. Whether he found peace in those efforts is ultimately unknowable, but he acted with the seriousness of a man who had seen how easily power could crush both enemies and innocents. He became a study in contradiction, a figure who embodied both the ambitions of empire and a yearning for moral reconciliation. The story of Ashoka's rise is therefore not a tidy parable but a sustained exploration of power's capacity to transform. His life shows that ambition can lead to empire building, yet also, paradoxically, to the intimacy of moral introspection. He demonstrates that rulers are not merely cold calculators of advantage, they are human beings who respond to suffering, to the faces of those affected by their choices, and to the persistent question of what it means to rule rightly. The arc of his life bends from blood to conscience, but never fully divorces him from the political realities that created him. Even in places where memory fades, traces endure. Pillars and edicts that once bore his voice have withered centuries, their words chipped but not erased, their intent still legible to those who seek them. They speak of policies, of admonitions for kind treatment, and of the ruler's desire to be remembered not solely as a conqueror but as a caretaker. Monasteries that once flourished under his patronage continued to serve communities, and old trade routes that received attention in his time remained corridors of exchange and culture. The rise of Ashoka is also a lesson in the unpredictable interplay of personal history and public consequence. A young prince hardened by palace life and the necessities of command could simultaneously become a patron of welfare and a promoter of moral discipline. His story asks listeners to consider the many ways ambition can manifest. It can be a hunger for territory, a drive for stability, or a desire to leave a moral mark on history. In his life, these impulses collided and converged, producing a reign that was as formative as it was fraught. When we consider the arc from his early ambition to his later reforms, we are drawn into the messy decisions of those who hold power. Those decisions are often made under duress, in the face of threats that demand immediate action, and with imperfect information. Ashoka navigated all of this with a mind sharpened by experience and a conscience informed by suffering, producing policies that were at once pragmatic and aspirational. His legacy is a testament to the complexity of rule and the persistent human capacity to change course. Ultimately, the narrative of Ashoka's rise invites reflection on what leaders can become when they confront the consequences of their actions. He stands as a reminder that ambition need not always culminate in unchecked domination. It can also evolve into a resolute commitment to the well-being of subjects. The Prince of Blood and Ambition became, in time, a ruler who sought to bind a fractious world together not just by force, but by the steady application of moral and administrative care. That metamorphosis, with all its contradictions, remains one of history's most compelling stories. Listening to the arc of his life, one can imagine a man walking through the world he had remade, feeling at once the pride of achievement and the sting of what had been lost. He looked at roads that flowed with commerce, at wells that quenched thirst, at hospitals where the injured were tended, and he knew these were signs of a different kind of conquest. He had attempted to wield power so that it might become an instrument of relief rather than merely an expression of dominance. In that aim lay the heart of his late ambition. And yet the world is stubbornly complex. The structures he put in place required constant tending, and the morality he espoused needed the ballast of institutions that could survive short memories and shifting priorities. His life shows us both the possibility and the precariousness of reform. A single ruler can change the direction of an empire for a generation, perhaps longer, but the endurance of that change depends upon the hands that inherit his office and the choices they make. As the tale winds toward its later chapters, listeners are left with an image of a man who embodied contradiction and evolution. Ashoka's rise teaches that power is not a monolith, it is an evolving set of practices that respond to forces both within and beyond a ruler's control. He rose by blood and ambition, but he sought to reorient those very sources toward the relief of suffering and the maintenance of justice. His life offers a study in how authority can be repurposed, a story that reverberates across time in its lessons and warnings. The echoes of his rule are audible in the silence of the monuments he left and the continuing debates of historians and moralists who try to parse the man from the myth. He remains a figure who drew both praise for his benevolence and criticism for the means by which he attained and maintained power. In that duality lies the enduring fascination with his life, a life that asks of us not just to admire or condemn but to examine how authority can be wielded with awareness of human cost. So when you imagine Ashoka, imagine him as a figure in motion, a boy in a palace shadowed by plots, a warrior on a campaign, a ruler in the quiet aftermath of battle, and finally as an elder who crafted policy with the weight of remorse and hope. He is not a single story but a tapestry of moments that collectively trace the rise of a man shaped by his age and who, in turn, shaped his age. His life is a reminder that ambition, when tempered by reflection and directed toward public good, can yield forms of governance that are complex, imperfect, and, sometimes, transformative. And as you drive or go about your tasks, consider the contours of that transformation, the slow accretion of decisions, the interplay of force and compassion, and the enduring question of how one life can change many. Ashoka's journey from Prince of Blood and Ambition to a ruler intent on moral governance asks you to ponder the possibilities of power itself. It leaves us asking whether the past offers models for the present, and whether leaders today might learn from the uneasy alchemy of conquest and conscience that defined his reign. In the quiet spaces left by kings and empires, where stones bear faint inscriptions and monasteries keep slow watch, Ashoka's voice persists in admonitions carved into pillars and the subtle reordering of societies he influenced. The rise of this prince was not a single stroke of genius or brutality, but the cumulative outcome of choices, adjustments, and a surprising capacity for moral self-scrutiny. He remains a potent figure for those who study the human uses and abuses of power, an emblem of what rulers can become when they let ambition be reinterpreted by conscience. That is the long shadow of Ashoka's rise, a narrative that refuses to settle for simple definitions, a life that bridges the primal language of conquest and the reflective vocabulary of compassion. His story endures because it speaks to fundamental human concerns, how we govern, how we bear the weight of our actions, and how we reconcile the need for order with the imperative to alleviate suffering. In listening to his tale, we are invited to reflect on our own moments of choice, our own balances between ambition and empathy, and the ways in which power might be used to craft a more humane world. He was born into a dynasty that stretched its shadow over the subcontinent, a young prince whose name would be carved across stone and conscience alike. The name was Ashoka. His early years belonged to the bustle and calculation of court life, to training with teachers and generals, and to the steady drumbeat of empire that made the palace a center of strategy as much as of ceremony. Even then, the echoes of ambition and duty mixed with quieter moments, books read by candlelight, walks through gardens, the private touch of a mind that watched and learned. It would be this mixture, the worldly and the reflective, that set the stage for the single campaign that would change him and his empire forever, the conquest of Kalinga. Kalinga lay to the east of his capital, a long coastal territory that had never been fully subdued by the central kings. Its people were seafarers and traders, its harbors gateways for goods and ideas, and its identity stubbornly distinct from the plains ruled by the Mauryans. To the rulers in Pataliputra, Kalinga was both prize and problem, a region that resisted taxation, challenged authority, and offered a route to the riches of the Bay of Bengal. For Ashoka, then a prince eyeing the consolidation of a vast realm, Kalinga was a test. Could his power bind the edges of the empire to its heart? The months before the march to Kalinga were marked by counsel and calculation. Advisors crowded corridors, generals whispered over maps, and spies returned with reports about the lay of the land and the temper of its people. Some urged caution, reminding the court of the region's fierce independence and the cost of a protracted war. Others promised swift victory, pointing to the strength of the Mauryan armies and the political advantages of controlling the eastern sea lanes. In the end, choice tilted toward conquest. Ashoka, newly ascended and determined to assert his rule, gave the order. The army assembled with the efficiency of a state that had invented logistics on a grand scale: elephants, chariots, cavalry, infantry, lines of supply stretching like the veins of a deliberate body. It is tempting to imagine that the decision was merely strategic, but history always hosts a confluence of motives: prestige, security, the hunger for a legacy, and the pressure to demonstrate that the center of the empire could not be defied with impunity. Setting out, the army moved through landscapes that shifted from the rivers and plains of the heartland to the coastal soils of eastern India. Each day's march altered the horizon, the taste of salt in the air increased as they neared the bay, the rhythms of life they encountered along the way hinted at cultures that had long traded with distant shores. Kalinga itself was not a single city but a tapestry of towns and villages, docks and forests, and its defenders were not merely soldiers but communities determined to preserve their way of life. These were not anonymous enemies to be broken, they were neighbors who had their own histories and stakes in the confrontation. The battle that unfolded on the banks of the Daya River marked a storm point for the region and for Ashoka's soul. Contemporary accounts, later inscriptions, and the reverberating silence of missing records make the exact choreography of the conflict a place for careful reconstruction rather than simple retelling. What is clear is that the fighting was fierce, and that the human cost was direct and enormous. Armies clash and lives vanish, but rarely does a clash in the ancient world produce such vivid aftermath that the mind cannot turn away from it without sorrow. As the armies met, the sounds of combat would have been terrible and immediate: armor striking, the neighing and trampling of elephants, shouted orders, and the thin, metallic bite of weapons. Elephants at the time served as both engines of war and symbols of status, towering amid the chaos and terrifying opposing lines. Wounded, they could cause as much havoc among their own ranks as among the enemy. The Kalingan defense relied on knowledge of their terrain, on naval elements near the coast, and on warriors whose determination made them formidable despite the rage of imperial machinery. When the dust settled on that day, the cost would be counted not merely in strategic terms but in the lived grief of millions. The numbers given by later inscriptions suggest a devastating toll: tens of thousands killed, many more wounded, and thousands sold into slavery. The scale of suffering is almost impossible to hold without collapsing into abstraction, so it helps to imagine the human faces behind the figures: the mother who would never tend to her child again, the farmer whose village burned, the merchant whose ship would remain in harbor because there were no hands left to sail her. The immediate military result, by the accounts of the time, was a Mauryan victory. Kalinga was subdued and brought into the ad hoc embrace of the empire. But victory was a kind of rupture, not a consoling end. On the day after the battle, Ashoka's reaction became the fulcrum of history. He stood amid the evidence of triumph and found, to his own surprise and horror, an abyss of suffering. Witnessing wounded men and the bereaved and the enslaved, he experienced an awakening that would transform him. This is not to say he instantly renounced power or ambition. Rather, the images of pain entered his conscience in a way that would recalibrate every subsequent choice. What followed was not merely private remorse. Ashoka, now emperor in full, sought to embed his changed outlook into the mechanisms of rule. He became a communicator of conscience. He issued edicts carved on pillars and rocks across the empire, messages designed to reach subjects far from the capital. These inscriptions are a bridge between his inner conversion and the public world. They tell us, in fragments and in different registers, of the transition from a ruler who believed in the unambiguous utility of conquest to one who promoted welfare, restraint, and moral responsibility. From war to wisdom, Ashoka's journey wasn't just about ruling, it was about becoming human again. Subscribe and share in the comments what moves you more, his courage to change or his will to guide others toward peace. The edicts speak plainly in places of the horrors of Kalinga and the lessons Ashoka claimed to have learned. He spoke of remorse, of the suffering of relatives and families who counted the dead, and of his determination to pursue a path of dharma, an ethic that encompassed nonviolence, compassion, and the welfare of his people. These words echo like a hand extended across centuries, surprising because they came from a monarch who had once unleashed overwhelming force. He did not pretend ignorance, instead he spoke of what he called the remorse that arose in his mind. Behind the inscriptions, the administrative wheels turned to implement new policies that matched his moral rhetoric. Ashoka supported the planting of medicinal herbs, the building of hospitals, and the welfare of animals. He instructed governors and officials to act with leniency, to avoid needless war, and to promote ethical education. The shift was not just cinematic or personal, it was institutional, seeking to move an empire from the primacy of conquest to a more humane stewardship. Yet the transition was complex and sometimes contradictory. An empire is a web of interests, local powers, and entrenched customs. Changing its temperature overnight was impossible. There remained those who saw strength in a ready sword and who were skeptical of the new emphasis on moral governance. The state's economic demands required taxation and enforcement, and border pressures sometimes compelled military preparedness. Ashoka had to find a balance between his ethical impulses and the practicalities of running a vast, diverse, and often fractious polity. In trying to balance, he deployed both statesmanship and symbolism. He sent emissaries abroad, reaching out to Hellenistic kings and to neighboring rulers with messages of friendship and, sometimes, of gentle persuasion. He supported Buddhist missionaries, helped spread moral teachings, and invested in building stupas and places of learning. Symbolic acts, such as the erection of edicts in public places, operated as both moral instruction and political consolidation. They made the emperor's voice audible and his intentions visible across mountains and plains. Scholars who study Ashoka pay careful attention to the sources that narrate his life and the conquest. The edicts he ordered are primary documents, direct lines from his own administrative voice, and they provide both facts and moral testimony. Other records are later, composed by Buddhist monks and chroniclers who shaped his image in devotional texts. This means historians must practice the slow work of triangulation, reading the raw authority of inscriptions against the devotional tone of later biographies, and teasing out what each source intends to show. The Kalinga episode occupies a special place in this historiography because it sits at the intersection of fact and meaning. On the one hand, it's a military event, battle lines, supplies, casualties. On the other hand, it's a narrative about conscience and the capacity for a ruler to change. Historians debate everything from the precise numbers of the dead to the chronology of events and the genuine depth of Ashoka's conversion. Such debates matter because they reveal how we use past events to interpret the relationship between power and morality. To understand why Kalinga mattered so deeply, one must also understand the nature of the Mauryan state before Ashoka's change. Chandragupta and Bindusara, his predecessors, had built an apparatus of rule that prized control, intelligence gathering, and civic order. The empire's strength lay in its roads, in its administrative divisions, and in a network of officials who stamped their authority onto daily life. For such a machine, the conquest of outlying regions was usually a question of efficiency and precedent. Holding territory meant being able to extract resources and enforce uniform law. Kalinga resisted that logic. Its coastal economy and its autonomous communities made it less susceptible to the straightforward imposition of direct rule. Bringing Kalinga into the fold would, in the eyes of the court, complete a map of influence that reached both the Ganges basin and the eastern littoral. The Mauryan military might was thus deployed not merely to seize land but to secure trade routes and to signal the reach of imperial reach. Yet this very demonstration of power produced the moral crisis that reshaped the empire's trajectory. There are descriptions in ancient texts that capture the human texture of the post-battle scenes, the lines of wounded on the banks, the abandoned chariots and broken standards, the smell of blood mixing with the scent of overturned earth. Survivors wandered the camps while the victors counted their spoils and their dead. Ashoka would walk through this landscape with a ruler's eyes, but also with a conscience that had been pried open by what he saw. He could not turn away. His responsibilities had always demanded awareness, but this awareness now bore a different quality. It had the weight of moral reckoning. This moral reckoning led to tangible shifts in policy that had consequences for millions. The edicts instruct officials to avoid capital punishment in many cases, to practice mercy, and to engage in regular inspections of the provinces to ensure justice. New investments in social welfare changed the ways communities experienced the state, hospitals for people and animals, wells in arid regions, and supports for travelers. These were not mere optics. They remade the relationship between citizen and sovereign in incremental but significant ways. Ashoka's embrace of a doctrine he called Dharma was broad and inclusive rather than narrowly sectarian. He did not demand conversion, rather, he advocated moral improvement across religious lines. His outreach extended to Brahmins, to Jains, to Buddhists, and to ordinary citizens, with a focus on living ethically, speaking truthfully, and treating others with compassion. This philosophical posture made his reign noteworthy because it proposed a form of governance that integrated ethical teaching with the duties of kingship. We must also consider the regional aftermath in Kalinga itself. The people of Kalinga did not simply vanish into the pages of imperial admin. They lived on, reconstructed their towns, and adapted to new circumstances. Over time, Kalinga would reassert facets of its identity and continue participating in maritime trade that connected the subcontinent to Southeast Asia. The city-states and ports of the Bay of Bengal maintained their vitality, and Kalingan culture left enduring marks on art, language, and commerce. Subjugation did not erase identity, it forced new negotiations between local autonomy and imperial presence. Ashoka's transformation had ripple effects beyond his borders, too. Other rulers read his edicts and took note of a model where the ruler's legitimacy rested not only on victory but on the welfare of the people. Embassies and envoys carried snippets of his reforms to distant courts, and the very idea that a monarch might publicly profess moral aims influenced the language of rulership in South Asia. Even if every successor did not emulate his conversion, the precedent became a reference point in political imagination. The king is a moral caregiver as well as a warlord. The narrative of Ashoka and Kalinga also invites reflection on how history remembers remorse. We often think of leaders as fixed types, merciful or ruthless, but Ashoka complicates that binary. His story shows how exposure to suffering can catalyze a reorientation of priorities, but it also stresses that institutions make such change difficult to enact smoothly. His remorse was not a simple retreat from politics but a reconfiguration of governance, a mixture of personal transformation with public policy adjustments that were sometimes partial and contested. People have long debated whether Ashoka's conversion was genuine or politically opportunistic. Skeptics suggest that a ruler might use moral language to consolidate authority, to neutralize dissent, or to garner religious legitimacy. Others see in his long practice of issuing edicts, his international outreach, and the concrete projects he funded evidence of sincerity. The truth probably resides in a gray space, a genuine emotional reckoning that also served imperial ends, because states rarely act without both moral and pragmatic considerations intertwined. Consider, too, the medium of the edicts themselves, polished stone pillars and rock faces chosen for permanence and public visibility. Carving messages in stone was an expensive and deliberate act. These weren't private letters but public performances meant to endure. The medium reinforced content. The king wanted his voice to resonate across generations, to be read by the literate and recited by the illiterate through public proclamation. It was an early form of what we might now call propaganda, but one that also contained a novel emphasis on ethical governance rather than mere triumphalism. The imagery of the pillars is striking as well. Many were topped with sculptures, lions, bulls, and mythic creatures that communicated imperial authority through visual means even before the words were read. The combination of text and carved emblem created a sensory experience of royal instruction. You saw the mark of the king, you felt the weight of permanence, and then you read the mandates that followed. This careful orchestration underscored Ashoka's desire to be both recognized and remembered, not merely for conquest but for a particular moral stance. Art and architecture also bore the stamp of the change in the realm's ethos. The stupas and monastic foundations supported by Ashoka contributed to the proliferation of Buddhist institutions, but they were also spaces where art and spirituality merged into civic life. Sculpture, reliefs, and painted narratives in sanctuaries helped translate ethical teachings into images that people could connect with. Over time, these visual cultures carried forward some of the emperor's values into popular imagination and devotional practice. The role of Buddhist monks and lay teachers in spreading Ashoka's ideals cannot be overstated. Missionaries traveled to regions as diverse as Sri Lanka and Central Asia, carrying texts, relics, and stories of a ruler who had embraced Dharma. They were agents not only of religion but of cultural exchange, facilitating the spread of a language of care and ethical instruction across borders. This network helped solidify the idea that politics and morality could be articulated together, and it made the story of Ashoka a common touchstone across distant communities. But the edicts also reflect a pragmatic streak: instructions about the duties of officials, requests for accurate reporting from the provinces, and reminders for magistrates to exercise fairness. These passages show that Ashoka did not abandon governance in favor of abstract morality. He sought to embed moral imperatives into the functioning of the state. The result was a governance model that expected bureaucrats to do more than collect taxes, that expected them to be agents of welfare. Such a model required oversight, incentives, and a steady hand, and it transformed administrative culture in subtle ways. Kalinga returned as a recurrent motif in art and literature, a narrative about suffering and redemption that resonated through centuries. Poets and storytellers found in the episode a dramatic hinge around which to turn questions about the nature of power and conscience. The image of a monarch struck down not by war but by the memory of the war's toll provided fertile material for moral reflection in later generations. It became a parable of sorts, that even the mightiest are not immune to the weight of human loss. The story's moral clarity often invites reinterpretation. In some retellings, Ashoka's response is portrayed as immediate and absolute. In others, it is treated as an evolving outlook, a bureaucracy-adjusted compromise that attempted to keep the state stable while changing its aims. Both readings illuminate different aspects of leadership, the capacity for immediate moral shock and the slow institutional work needed to turn ideals into policy. The true narrative likely contains elements of both, with Ashoka moved by the horrors and then working, imperfectly, to change the machinery around him. The conquest of Kalinga can also be understood in terms of long-distance economic and cultural networks. Kalinga's ports connected India to Southeast Asia, facilitating the movement of spices, textiles, and ideas. Controlling those corridors meant more than land. It meant influence over trade routes that could redirect wealth and cultural exchange. Mauryan control of Kalinga, therefore, had repercussions for the economic map of the Indian Ocean, and the aftereffects of the conquest influenced which cities prospered and which receded. It's worth reflecting on the voices we almost never hear in this history, the ordinary people of Kalinga whose names were not recorded, the children who became orphans, the artisans whose workshops were pillaged. They inhabit the silent spaces between official records, and reconstructing their lives requires empathy as much as scholarship. Archaeology and local traditions sometimes provide hints, objects recovered from burned layers, oral histories that preserve memory, but much remains irretrievable. The challenge for anyone who tells the story of Kalinga is to hold these absences in mind and not let the grandeur of empire drown out the smaller human tragedies. When Ashoka publicly declared his remorse, he invited a moral conversation across his realm. His edicts counseled forbearance in matters of faith. He argued for respect among differing sects and for tolerance as a civic virtue. In a political climate often marked by coercion and religious monopoly, such a public endorsement of pluralism was unusual. It set a precedent that political authority could, at least rhetorically, support coexistence and mutual respect among diverse communities. The international dimension of Ashoka's outreach also broadened the stakes of his conversion. He sent envoys to Hellenistic kings with messages that combined practical diplomacy and moral exhortation. These letters were less about spiritual conversion and more about establishing networks of respect and exchange. They suggest that Ashoka's moral project had a pragmatic edge. If rulers could be friends rather than perpetual rivals, trade and cultural exchange might flourish under a less violent umbrella of relations. A complex figure like Ashoka defies simple categorization because his life encompassed war and compassion, conquest and philanthropy. These contradictions make his story appealing to historians, artists, and political thinkers alike, because it raises perennial questions. Can power be tempered by empathy? Can a ruler's remorse reshape a polity? The Kalinga episode functions as a dramatic test case for such inquiries, a historical fulcrum where the human and the political intersect in messy, consequential ways. Across time, Ashoka became a symbol used differently by different groups. Buddhists celebrated his patronage and moral turn as evidence of the religion's capacity to influence rulers. Political leaders sometimes invoked him as a prototype of a benevolent monarch who cares for subjects. Modern interpreters, artists, novelists, and historians have projected onto him contemporary values they wish to emphasize, be it human rights, social welfare, or the idea of the ethical state. His life thus evolved into an interpretive mirror reflecting the priorities of later ages. The archaeology of Kalinga and surrounding regions has slowly filled in the backdrop of the story. Excavations reveal urban centers, pottery workshops, and maritime installations that show a vibrant cultural landscape prior to and after the Mauryan incursion. These finds challenge narratives that reduce Kalinga to a mere military target. Instead, they show a society that was dynamic, interconnected, and resilient. Such material evidence gives texture to the narrative and reminds us that war is only one episode in a longer human story. The language of the edicts also invites close reading. Ashoka used simple, direct phrases intended to be understood by a broad audience. He did not cloak his messages in lofty metaphors. He spoke plainly about behavior he wanted to encourage and avoid. That rhetorical choice tells us about his intentions. He sought practical moral reform, not merely philosophical abstraction. The clarity of language made the rules accessible and made the emperor's expectations comprehensible to a diverse array of subjects. One of the most poignant aspects of the Kalinga aftermath is the image of an emperor who could not reconcile victory with his conscience. It is a rare historical moment where a ruling figure publicly admits moral error on a policy level. Leaders often conceal missteps. Ashoka instead used his platform to confess and to craft a plan for recalibration. This act has resonated through centuries because it models accountability at a scale rarely documented in ancient sources. Yet it would be an oversimplification to claim that the empire stopped all warfare or became pacifist after Kalinga. Military forces remained part of the state's fabric, and the exigencies of defense never vanished. Ashoka's policies aimed at limiting unnecessary aggression and fostering diplomatic means where possible, but the logic of security and territorial interest persisted. His reign therefore represents a nuanced attempt to blend restraint with realism in the exercise of state power. The pedagogical impact of Ashoka's edicts also deserves attention. They were intended to instruct not only rulers and officials but also ordinary citizens, encouraging ethical conduct in daily life. They promoted charity, nonviolence, and respect for elders and parents. By embedding these values in public discourse, Ashoka attempted to shape social norms as much as laws, seeking a cultural shift that would make ethical governance more sustainable. When we explore the sensory details of Ashoka's program, we find tangible markers: wells dug for travelers, shelters built for the sick, groves planted for shade and spiritual reflection. Such public works were material manifestations of a moral vision. They made the state's benevolence visible to those it served. This kind of infrastructural compassion added a practical dimension to rhetorical commitments and created daily reminders of the ruler's concern for welfare. Ashoka's relationship with Buddhist institutions was complex and instrumental. He provided patronage and used them as partners in moral instruction, but he did not transform the state into a theocracy. He kept the state's machinery largely intact while aligning it with a moral purpose that his patronage helped spread. This subtlety allowed him to gain the moral authority of Buddhist institutions while preserving the administrative breadth needed to govern an empire of such scale. In some ways, the Kalinga episode can be read as a moral parable about unintended consequences. The drive to secure the empire led to a victory that produced moral injury for the victor. It is a cautionary tale about how the pursuit of power can generate unforeseen costs that are not merely strategic but deeply human. Ashoka's response suggests that acknowledging these costs can be the first step toward reform, even if reform is difficult and incomplete. Beyond moral lessons, the conquest raises questions about the nature of resistance. Kalinga's defenders chose to fight, perhaps knowing the scale of the opponent, because their identity and autonomy mattered more than capitulation. Resistance, even when unsuccessful, can shape the victor as much as the vanquished, because it forces the conqueror to confront the reality of their action. In Ashoka's case, Kalinga's resistance forced a moral confrontation that the court had not anticipated. The psychological dimensions of Ashoka's change are fertile ground for reflection. Empathy and proximity to suffering are often catalysts for moral change, and a ruler who tours the aftermath of his own policies is likely to be affected in ways that differ from those who only hear reports. The intimacy of seeing injured bodies and hearing lamentations can produce a visceral reaction that abstract counsel cannot. This human element clarifies why the Kalinga event mattered. It inserted tangible suffering into the mind of the ruler. When later generations told Ashoka's story, they often emphasized the role of Buddhist teachings in his moral awakening. The monkish literature that survives paints a portrait of a king receptive to the Dharma's ethical imperatives. These accounts may embellish or interpret events through a religious lens, but they also preserve the sense that spiritual counsel was available and that the king listened. Whether the religious influence was decisive or complementary, it played a part in shaping the rhetoric and institutions of the era. The global echoes of Ashoka's policy are intriguing when we consider the diffusion of ideas across the ancient world. His advocacy for kindness and tolerance, and his use of public inscriptions to disseminate those values, anticipate later political ideas about welfare and responsibility. While we should not impose modern frameworks anachronistically, it's fair to say that Ashoka's blend of ethics and statecraft forms an early model of governance where moral aims are allied with administrative capacity. This intersection invites continual comparison with later political experiments in moralized rulership. On a more intimate scale, Ashoka's own life after the war underwent a private reorientation. Historians imagine him often as a man who moved more slowly, who thought deeply about the consequences of decree, and who sought counsel from religious teachers as well as from administrators. He may have preferred the quiet of his gardens more than before, and perhaps he measured incentives with a new moral yardstick. Though we can never recover his inner monologue, the public record of his policies suggests a leader who allowed personal anguish to inform public duty. The memory of Kalinga also influenced legal and ethical thinking in South Asia. The edict's emphasis on reducing unnecessary killing and on compassion resonated with philosophical traditions that debated the nature of violence and duty. Ashoka's practical attempts to reduce cruelty fed into long-standing dialogues about the righteous use of force and the rights of subaltern populations. This dialogue would persist in different forms and continue to shape moral reasoning in subsequent centuries. We can also look at the economic aftereffects of the conquest, which were multifaceted. In the short term, the state benefited from access to port revenues and resources, which could be redirected toward public works and administration. In the longer term, the integration of Kalinga into the Mauryan polity altered trade patterns in the Bay of Bengal. These shifts influenced which urban centers profited and the flow of commodities, effects that took generations to stabilize and that altered the social map of eastern India. Military historians examine the tactics used in the Kalinga campaign with interest. The use of elephant corps, the coordination between different arms of the army, and the logistical feats of moving provisions across varied terrain show a sophisticated military apparatus. But the same sources also highlight the limits of such might when confronted with morale, terrain, and the human cost of battle. The tactical story thus complements the moral story. It explains how the victory occurred while simultaneously underlining that victory can come with moral consequences that strategy alone cannot calculate. Ashoka's edicts are also a window into the bureaucratic culture that supported his reforms. The instructions for regular inspection tours, for fair treatment of prisoners, and for the care of animals show a state that relied on administrative discipline. Officials were expected to act not simply as tax collectors but as custodians of public welfare. This expanded role for the bureaucracy had the potential to change the lived experience of governance across the empire. The narrative of the conquest and aftermath also touches on the psychology of memory, how communities remember trauma, and how rulers attempt to shape that memory. Ashoka wanted to register his remorse and to instruct future generations, but he also sought to smooth the path toward reconciliation. How well that worked varied by region and by the intensity of local grief. Memory did not dissolve at the turn of a decree. It lingered in family stories, in rituals of mourning, and in the slow work of rebuilding. Ashoka's transformation was not a solitary phenomenon. It involved networks of advisors, religious leaders, and administrators who helped translate his moral vision into action. Monks and officials collaborated on building projects, on visiting provinces, and on conducting ethical instruction. This collective aspect shows that moral reform at state level depends on groups willing to undertake laborious implementation. The emperor's moral resolve thus catalyzed a broader social effort to reorient policy. Historians also examine the rhetoric Ashoka used to justify his choices, noting how he framed his policies as service to the people rather than as gestures of paternalism. He spoke of promoting the welfare of all beings and of acting for the common good, language that implies a notion of responsibility that goes beyond narrow autocratic rule. This rhetorical stance demanded reciprocal good behavior from officials and citizens alike, creating a moral compact rather than unilateral command. The complexity of Ashoka's reign suggests that the moral dimension of governance is never pure. It must grapple with the messy realities of power. He tried to reduce cruelty while maintaining order, to promote compassion while securing borders, and to sponsor moral education while managing a diverse population. That he pursued these aims at all is remarkable, given the era's typical approach to rulership, but it also reveals the limits of ethical monarchy in the face of practical constraints. Over centuries, the legend of Ashoka entwined with local histories and devotional narratives, producing a rich tapestry of stories that sometimes diverged from the historical record. The popular imagination liked the storyline of a warrior-turned-saint king, and artists and bards embellished details to match the tastes of their audiences. These retellings often amplify themes of redemption and moral courage, making the tale of Kalinga an enduring moral drama rather than a footnote in military annals. From a humanistic perspective, the most striking lesson of the Kalinga episode is the possibility of change. Ashoka did not remain enclosed within the logic of conquest. He allowed experience to reshape his values and then attempted to instill that reorientation across his realm. That capacity for revision underlines a hopeful strand of political life, that moral awakening is not merely a private event but can be institutionalized, however imperfectly. This idea continues to inspire debates about leadership and reform in modern contexts. Yet even as we celebrate the moral dimensions, we must hold in view the persistent inequalities and violences that remained. Not all suffering ceased under Ashoka's rule, and not all officials followed his counsel with equal zeal. The ideal of compassion encountered the hard realities of enforcement, corruption, and local power struggles. Acknowledging these imperfections does not negate his achievements but grounds them in a realistic understanding of political change as incremental and contested. The story of Kalinga also opens a conversation about the ethics of historical judgment. How do we assess a ruler who both inflicted and attempted to heal immense harm? Is the partial redirection of policy enough to outweigh the violence that precipitated it? These thorny questions do not yield simple answers, but they push us to evaluate leadership holistically, taking into account actions, intentions, and consequences over time. Ashoka's life serves as a rich case study for such moral reflection. Artistic representations of Ashoka, from dramatic plays to cinematic treatments, often focus on the personal inner turmoil and outward reform that followed Kalinga. Directors and novelists emphasize his solitary walks among the wounded, his tearful confession, and his public declarations of remorse. These emotional portrayals resonate because they humanize a figure who might otherwise be reduced to stone inscriptions and administrative decrees. They remind listeners that history is not just about institutions but about people who feel and choose. The multidimensional legacy of Ashoka and Kalinga continues to inform modern political thought in South Asia. Leaders and thinkers have cited his edicts when arguing for compassion in social policy or for the moral obligations of the state. The modern usage is often selective, highlighting aspects of his governance that fit contemporary aims, but even selective invocation underscores the enduring power of the narrative. Ashoka's example persists because it provides a template for the possibility of ethical governance within a political system. Looking at the broader cultural field, Kalinga's resistance and Ashoka's remorse have influenced literature, sculpture, and religious discourse across centuries. Monastic chronicles, royal genealogies, and folk songs each contribute threads to the historical fabric. Artists translate the narrative into images of both suffering and serenity, pairing battlefield ruins with serene stupas as a visual juxtaposition of war and peace. In doing so, they create a dialectic that invites continuous reflection on the consequences of power. The excavation of edicts and archaeological remains has also allowed modern audiences to connect physically with the past. Visiting a carved pillar or a stupa can be a tactile way to imagine the past, to feel the rough grooves where chisel met stone, and to read the emperor's intentions in carved letters. Physical artifacts bridge time and provide a sensory route into history that complements textual study. These remains make the story of Kalinga less abstract and more immediate, renewing its emotional force for contemporary audiences. Educational curricula in South Asia often include Ashoka as a significant historical figure, teaching students about the moral and administrative innovations attributed to him. Young learners encounter the juxtaposition of conquest and compassion as a formative myth about leadership. The pedagogical framing tends to highlight the redemptive arc, how a ruler confronted the consequences of his actions and tried to change course. Such teaching shapes public memory and contributes to the ongoing resonance of the Kalinga episode in popular consciousness. Historians caution against romanticization, however. Romantic accounts sometimes smooth over the messy compromises and political exigencies that underlay Ashoka's policies. To understand his reign properly, one must appreciate both the nobility of his intentions and the complexities of their implementation. That balanced view is more challenging but ultimately more illuminating, because it acknowledges both human aspiration and institutional constraint. Another layer of the story concerns technology and communication. The ability to carve edicts across vast distances made it possible to disseminate a consistent moral message in a way previously unavailable to rulers. Stone inscriptions functioned as durable broadcasts in an era before printing presses and mass media. This innovation in statecraft underscores how technological means can amplify political values, for better or worse, depending on who wields them and to what ends. Collectors of history often note the striking paradox: an emperor renowned for ruthlessness in war who then devoted his reign to alleviating suffering. This paradox makes Ashoka a figure of perennial interest because it confronts our assumptions about consistency and the psychology of power. The paradox invites us to imagine other historical instances where moral reorientation followed from crisis, and to consider how public policy can be shaped by private conscience. That tension makes his story endlessly engaging and instructive. In the centuries after Ashoka, the political landscape continued to shift. Empires rose and fell, and Kalinga's ports waxed and waned in influence. Yet the story persisted in the cultural memory, repeated and adapted to new historical contexts. It became not merely a lesson about one man but a template for discussing how leaders might integrate moral concern into policy in times of expansion and consolidation. The narrative's adaptability is part of its strength. Modern historians sometimes revisit Ashoka's edicts with new methods, linguistic analysis, comparative archaeology, and digital mapping that reveal the geographic breadth of his messaging. These technologies let us see patterns of inscription placement and connect them to trade routes, administrative centers, and cultural nodes. Such studies refine our understanding of the reach and intent of Ashoka's communications, showing a deliberate strategy to speak across the empire. They make the past legible in new ways without stripping it of its human poignancy. The aesthetic legacy of Ashoka and Kalinga appears in subsequent artistic traditions, where motifs of suffering and redemption recur. Sculptors and painters find in the story visual metaphors for transformation: a broken spear beside a blooming lotus, a blood-stained banner alongside a tranquil stupa. These images translate ethical teachings into forms that speak to the eye as well as the ear, allowing the narrative to reach audiences who might not encounter the edicts themselves. The power of such imagery lies in its ability to convey moral tension nonverbally and across cultural boundaries. Finally, the story of the conquest and its aftermath invites us to a personal reflection about the demands of leadership and the capacity for moral growth. Ashoka's life suggests that power need not be a recipe for unending violence, and that recognition of harm can lead to durable institutional change. Yet it also warns us that moral change requires persistent work, social support, and structural adjustment. The conquest of Kalinga was both a tragic rupture and a starting point for a different kind of rule, leaving to posterity a narrative rich in caution, hope, and complexity. He was born into a world of stone and sun where empires rose like monoliths and fell like shadows at dusk. From his earliest breath, the rhythm of palace life, bells, sandals, strategists, made a quiet claim on his bones. Those sounds stitched themselves into the sinew of ambition long before he understood the shape of compassion. As a youth, he learned the grammar of power: how to stand, how to issue commands, how to make decisions that would ripple across river and field. He watched generals map the world into territories to be taken and defended, and he learned to speak in the terse, clean lines of strategy. The language of conquest rested easily in his mouth at first, as if it were simply another dialect of being alive. There were teachers who taught him letters and arithmetic, and there were men who taught him how to hold a sword so that it felt like an extension of his arm. He mastered the arts required of a ruler: etiquette, diplomacy, cunning, because mastery promised a steadier throne. Yet beneath those skills, a certain restlessness lingered, an uncentered feeling that sometimes pulled him awake in the middle of the night. He watched, too, the shimmering life of his people: merchants hawking spices, children racing kites under the monsoon sky, women weaving threads into stories. Those scenes penetrated him in small, sharp ways, like splinters. They lodged in him a sense that lives could be whole or broken depending on the whims of those who wore crowns. It was easy to be distant when the world was seen at a remove, but the distance widened the gap between seeing and feeling. When he took his first steps toward the throne, the corridors of power swallowed him with polite hunger. Courtiers bowed and recalculated alliances with the speed of a snapping twig. Each act of submission reinforced his sense of separation. He was both beloved and isolated by the rituals that guaranteed rule. War came to him as if it were inevitable, a force of nature that demanded to be acknowledged and mastered. He learned the choreography of mobilization: drums, banners, the clanking of armor, the steady march of feet across the earth. That rhythm could become intoxicating, and in its intoxication he found a clarity that narrowed his world to objectives and outcomes. The war in Kalinga arrived as a turning point shaped by geography, pride, and the calculus of empire. The map of the land seemed to call to him, a place of resources and seaports and stubborn independence. He pursued it with the same thoroughness he had applied to his education, confident that decisive action would secure everlasting peace for his realm. On the day the armies met, the land itself seemed to recoil under the weight of men and metal. Dust rose in clouds like a second sky, and the air tasted of iron and heat. For those who marched and those who waited at home, time condensed into moments of terrible intensity: the scream of a wound, the thud of a fall, the hush that follows a decisive blade. When the dust settled, the tally of suffering was not simply numbers on a scroll, it was a landscape of broken bodies and grieving faces. He walked through the aftermath with the sense of a man who had stepped into a room after a fire. He could count what remained, but the loss itself pressed like ash. In the faces of survivors he saw not enemy banners, but human beings with loved ones, livelihoods, and futures now altered beyond imagining. Days after the carnage, he found himself haunted by scenes that returned like relentless guests. The image of a woman cradling a child with no pulse became a memory that refused to be organized into neat facts. He began to understand, with an ache that broadened into his chest, that victory was not the clean thing he had once imagined. Those images did what images do when they are given enough room to breathe in a troubled soul: they opened cracks. He started to notice the small things he had previously overlooked: a beggar's raw palm, a farmer's crooked smile, a child whose eyes had learned to expect scarcity. Each tiny observation became a thread, and the threads began to weave a new fabric under his skin. His sleep became disturbed, not by the noise of the city but by a chorus of questions. What did it mean to rule a people whose lives were fragile clay beneath his feet? Could power be wielded without making the world a field of broken things? These queries pushed him toward a place where answers were not given in orders but sought through reflection. He encountered Buddhism in that reflective period as if it were an unexpected light in a dim corridor. Monks with simple robes and quiet faces spoke of causes and effects, of intention and consequence, of a way to live that did not feed the cycle of violence. Their words were not a rebuke but a mirror that refused to let him look away from his deeds. Listening to those teachings, he discovered a language that reoriented his understanding of strength. Compassion was not weakness in this view, it was a formidable discipline that required inner courage and honest reckoning. The idea of minimizing suffering as a guiding principle resonated with him in ways that were both liberating and disconcerting. He began to study the teachings not as an act of piety but as an investigation into how one might shape a polity that honored life. He read sutras and conversed with monks, sometimes late into the night, tracing the logic of moral consequence and the practicalities of governance. It became clear that the moral architecture of his rule could be redesigned, brick by careful brick. The transformation did not arrive as a sudden miracle but as an accumulation of small shifts. One by one, old reflexes loosened: the instinct to meet every threat with force, the reflex to make prerogative equal to legislation. In their place grew practices of deliberation, of consulting those who had once been ignored, of listening without the intent to immediately reply. He walked among his people in ways he had not before, not as a sovereign to be revered from a distance, but as a seeker of knowledge about the texture of ordinary life. He spent mornings in towns and afternoons by riverbanks, where he would sit with fishermen and hedge priests, absorbing the cadence of everyday speech. Those encounters taught him practical truths about suffering and resiliency that no scroll could fully convey. To enact the change he desired, he did not merely proclaim edicts carved in stone, he internalized a philosophy that demanded coherence between belief and action. He understood that true reform required more than decrees, it required the creation of institutions that reflected compassion as a principle of governance. In this way, his spiritual awakening entered the mechanics of administration. He ordered the construction of hospitals where none had stood before, places that welcomed the sick without question and offered relief as a matter of state policy. Physicians and healers were encouraged to share techniques, to learn from one another across the boundaries of caste and creed. To him, health was not charity but an investment in the collective dignity of a people. Roads and rest houses began to dot the empire, not only for merchants and messengers but for the ordinary traveler whose feet ached and whose provisions were scant. Wells were dug where thirst had been the quiet companion of many. These projects were small, practical acts with profound implications. They tethered the idea of compassion to the everyday movements of life. He banned certain brutal punishments and sought to humanize the penal system, believing that even those who transgressed the law were entitled to humane treatment. Corporal punishment was to be tempered with an eye toward rehabilitation rather than perpetual humiliation. This was not sentimentality, it was the belief that social order and human dignity were not mutually exclusive. In the halls of his court he championed debates about ethics and policy, inviting scholars of all persuasions to speak. He did not always accept their counsel, but he learned to weigh it in a way that disinterred his own biases. That practice of consultation altered the tone of governance, making decisions collaborative rather than purely autocratic. There were critics who dismissed these shifts as political theater, and there were loyalists who worried that compassion would be read as indecision. He listened to both sets of voices, not to be paralyzed, but to refine his intent. He was learning that the practice of compassion required resilience against cynicism, a steady insistence that policy could be both just and effective. He had always cared about the prosperity of his people, but now prosperity was no longer measured solely by the expansion of territory or the size of the treasury. It was also measured by the ease of a widow's life, the recovery of a plague-ridden village, the education of a child who might otherwise never hold a book. These metrics reshaped priorities and budgets, leading to tangible shifts in resource allocation. His embrace of nonviolence did not mean his empire ceased to defend itself. Rather, it meant a recalculation of when and how to use force. Diplomacy and cultural exchange were given new emphasis, and emissaries were instructed to seek mutual benefit over conquest. He learned to equate security with stability and well-being, a subtle but consequential redefinition. He sponsored translations and the circulation of teachings so that the moral philosophy he had taken to heart would not remain confined to monasteries. Scripts were carved into rocks along the highways, proclamations of principles meant to be seen by the passerby, injunctions to respect life, to speak truthfully, to abstain from cruelty. These inscriptions functioned as both moral reminders and public commitments. His edicts were not mere slogans but attempts to teach a shared ethical vocabulary to a diverse empire. They addressed kings and subjects alike, reminding all that the welfare of one was bound to the welfare of the whole. This rhetorical strategy aimed to weave a sense of collective responsibility into the fabric of daily life. He understood that true compassion had to consider the smallest creatures as well as the largest concerns. Royal decrees established protections for animals and encouraged humane treatment in slaughterhouses and marketplaces. Stables and gardens were planned with an eye toward the peaceful coexistence of humans and animals within urban life. Agriculture received attention not just for its yield but for its sustainability. He promoted practices that would protect soil and water, inviting experts to study the land and propose long-term solutions. The goal was not simply to extract wealth from the ground, but to ensure that generations to come would inherit soil capable of supporting life. His relationship with Buddhist monastics deepened, yet he maintained a pragmatic distance from doctrinal control. He supported monasteries and patronized religious scholarship while resisting attempts to let any single institution become the sole arbiter of spiritual life. He believed the state should facilitate moral growth, not monopolize it. Pilgrimages and the building of stupas became part of a cultural revival that extended beyond sectarian lines. People traveled to holy sites and returned with renewed rituals, songs, and a shared sense of belonging. Those journeys were more than spiritual, they were social threads knitting disparate regions into a common story. He also grappled with the tension between renunciation and responsibility. Some questioned whether a ruler who adopted ascetic practices could maintain the practical attentions of governance. He resolved that contemplative practice could enhance rather than diminish ruling capacities by fostering clarity and restraint where impulse had once dominated. Personal austerities entered his life in measured ways: meditative mornings, periods of silence, deliberate fasting not as penance but as training in empathy. These practices were private disciplines that seeped into public policy, tempering decisions with contemplative pause. The ruler who had once been driven by unexamined momentum now cultivated stillness as a tool of statecraft. He documented his principles so that they would outlive the fickleness of individual memory. Edicts were set down in stone, braille of conscience for the future, visible to anyone who traveled across the realm. In that act of inscription, he seemed to say that moral progress should not hinge on the whim of a single life, but be anchored in enduring commitments. The people responded in varied ways, as they always do when confronted by change. Some embraced the new measures with gratitude, feeling the softening of harsh edges in daily life. Others resisted, clinging to older structures that promised clear benefits to those who had long occupied positions of privilege. In towns and villages, local officials were encouraged to model compassion as policy and practice. They learned to consider the outcomes of their decisions on the frail and the marginalized. Through such decentralization, compassion trickled into the lived reality of governance, altering small acts into collective habit. He paid attention to education, believing that a morally informed populace would be less likely to be swayed by demagoguery. Schools were encouraged to teach not only arithmetic and history but also ethical reasoning and civic responsibility. In this way, he hoped to cultivate citizens who could imagine the world not as a set of adversaries but as a community of shared futures. He also recognized the role of story and song in shaping hearts, commissioning plays and epics that celebrated mercy and courage in equal measure. Cultural works were powerful because they carried values into the homes of people who might never visit a temple or a court. Through narrative, compassion became habitual, woven into bedtime tales and market chatter. There were personal sacrifices, too, that tested the integrity of his commitment. He had to let go of certain privileges that had been early accoutrements of power, actions that made him vulnerable to gossip and accusation. But each relinquishment clarified the texture of his new identity, a ruler who took compassion to be a principle, not an adornment. Those closest to him saw the change in subtle expressions, an increased softness in the eyes, a silence where once there had been rapid impatience, a tendency to ask rather than order. Occasionally, old habits resurfaced in moments of stress or insult, reminding him that moral transformation is rarely linear. He accepted those stumbles as part of a longer trajectory rather than evidence of failure. As his policies matured, the realm's external relations shifted as well. Neighboring kings took notice of a ruler who preferred treaties over onslaughts and reconstruction over pillage. Diplomatic ties deepened, and the region experienced a period of relative stability not solely because of military might but because of shared incentives to preserve life and commerce. He became known for sending ambassadors not just to negotiate but to learn, a practice that altered how foreign courts perceived him. Those emissaries returned with stories of other lands' customs and medicines, new methods of irrigation and trade, and reports that both humbled and inspired him. In this exchange, he saw the possibility that compassion could be a diplomatic currency. He commissioned surveys of public health and sanitation that revealed the hidden burdens of urban life, overcrowded alleys, stagnant water, and diseases that spread silently. Public works projects were initiated to address these matters, an effort to reduce preventable suffering through engineering and public education. Where practical solutions were possible, he believed moral desire needed to be matched by technological will. The empire became a laboratory of sorts for social innovations, and he encouraged experimentation while trying to minimize harm to vulnerable populations. When a new plan failed, it was treated as an instructive misstep rather than a moral catastrophe. Failure, reframed as data, helped refine policies into more humane forms of governance. He also cultivated a sense of the sacred in civic life, encouraging rituals that honored the earth and its bounty without prescribing a single creed. Seasonal festivals began to celebrate harvest and healing, integrating spiritual awareness with communal care. This sparked a cultural rhythm that reinforced the moral commitments he promoted. Within the palace, he created spaces where ordinary people could petition directly without intermediaries, a radical flattening of access that demystified the seat of power. He listened to petitions, sometimes traveling incognito to witness conditions himself, because he believed empathy needed the ballast of evidence. Those first-hand experiences were formative, converting abstract compassion into policy grounded in observation. The awakening of compassion also involved confronting the structures of inequality that had long been normalized. He moved cautiously but deliberately to reform the systems that perpetuated bondage and marginality, offering pathways to legal redress and social mobility. Such measures were met with resistance and required patient negotiation, because change of this scale always unsettles entrenched interests. He paid attention to the role of women in society and in governance, seeking to elevate their participation not through tokenism but through practical empowerment. Where possible, women were supported in commerce, health, and education, reflecting his understanding that societal health depends on the flourishing of all its members. These policies produced gradual shifts in respect and opportunity across communities. Artisans and craftsmen were encouraged to form guilds that could protect their labor and pass on knowledge to apprentices without exploitation. This attention to craft and fairness fortified local economies and created a new sense of dignity in labor. He saw in the skilled hands of these workers a kind of moral nobility, effort invested in beauty and utility alike. He practiced generosity not as spectacle but as structural reform, believing that the truest generosity was the kind that created systems for people to care for themselves. Charity without systems could be a palliative at best. Building systems that reduced need was the larger aim. This distinction marked his reformist impulse as both humane and practical. He also wrestled with the limitations of his own perspective and appointed advisors who could challenge his assumptions. He cultivated a small, trusted circle of counselors who blended moral seriousness with practical expertise. Those relationships served as both mirror and guide, tempering zeal with feasibility. Despite his many reforms, he never ceased to be haunted by the memory of conflict and loss. That haunting became a kind of moral engine rather than a torment that immobilized him. It pushed him to try more, to think harder, to imagine systems that could prevent such devastation. In that way, memory became responsibility transformed into action. He became a pilgrim of both land and conscience, traveling to sacred sites and to the corners of his realm to observe, to listen, and to learn. These journeys were not ceremonial alone, they were pedagogical, a means by which he could test policies in the field and witness their effects. Travel humbled him and renewed his commitment to make compassion tangible. He made room for ritual within a public ethic that never fully conflated piety with policy, insisting that spiritual life be voluntary and not state coercion. This balance acknowledged the personal nature of faith while preserving the public space for shared moral action. The nuance kept governance inclusive rather than doctrinaire. Over time, historians and chroniclers began to shape a narrative around his reign, one that emphasized the unusual combination of power and pity. Stories spread of roads lined with trees, of hospitals where strangers were treated like kin, of edicts that asked people to consider the consequences of their words and deeds. These stories, embroidered by storytellers, carried the essence of his reforms beyond the reach of any single generation. He aged into his role with an accumulated wisdom that softened the brusque certainties of youth. The crown sat on a head that now housed both the memory of earlier compulsions and the discipline of later restraint. He became, in many ways, a living compromise between the demands of rule and the aspiration to alleviate suffering. There were moments of private sorrow he kept from public view, late nights when he examined decisions that had gone awry, afternoons when old friends recalled the past with bitterness. He learned to carry regret as one carries a ledger, to account for error, to make restitution where possible, and to accept that not every harm could be undone. That acceptance was not resignation but a sober recognition of human limitation. He wrote letters to rulers in distant lands, not to boast but to exchange thoughts on governance, moral duty, and the public good. Those correspondences revealed a mind that sought conversation over conquest, curiosity over arrogance. Through such exchanges he extended his moral inquiry beyond borders, inviting a larger dialogue about the responsibilities of rulers everywhere. His inner life remained a site of continual practice. Mindfulness, study, and the cultivation of patience were daily disciplines. He spent hours in quiet reflection, sometimes conversing with solitary companions who could hold him accountable. The practice of inner work, he believed, amplified outward compassion, making it less performative and more profound. As his practices matured, even the language of the court changed subtly. Proclamations began to reference the welfare of the smallest and the most forgotten, and the phrase used to denote welfare acquired a moral tone. This lexical shift had practical consequences because words shape priorities. In time, the moral vocabulary he promoted became woven into the legal and administrative idioms of the realm. Travelers and traders brought back tales of a kingdom whose administration sought to minimize cruelty and practice kindness as a matter of policy. Merchants appreciated the safer roads and the more predictable legal environment, while pilgrims praised the hospices and temples that had been improved. These combined effects boosted both the material and moral health of the communities under his rule. He continued to invest in knowledge, encouraging polymaths and patronizing libraries where scholars could study medicine, mathematics, and metaphysics. He believed a well-educated populace would be better able to sustain and evolve ethical governance. In this regard, knowledge was not neutral, it was a tool to refine compassion into sustainable systems. Over the decades, his policies generated patterns that outlasted his personal power, embedding humane practices into the very architecture of governance. Local officials who had been trained in the new ethics carried those lessons forward, as did communities that had seen the benefits of humane policy. In this way, institutional change became cultural change, slow and uneven but increasingly robust. Despite the successes, there were limits to what any single ruler could accomplish, and he faced setbacks and reverses that reminded him of the stubbornness of human institutions. There were rebellions, economic downturns, and natural calamities that tested the patience of his people and the resilience of his reforms. He accepted these trials as the testing ground for the durability of compassion as policy. As his life approached its later years, he devoted more attention to ensuring a smooth succession, mindful that the values he had fostered would not evaporate with his passing. He sought to embed moral education and structural protections into institutions so that successors might find a stable ethical foundation on which to build. This forward-looking care felt to him like the truest legacy he could leave. He reflected often on the anatomy of his own awakening, tracing back the events and images that had compelled him to recalibrate his life. He recognized the Kalinga War as the fulcrum, not because it was the only cause of change, but because it made visible the consequences of untethered power. That visibility forced a choice, and in choosing compassion he committed his life to a different kind of greatness. He died with the sense that his work had only begun, as all meaningful projects do. Systems had been started, habits ingrained, and stories told, but the project of humanizing governance would require constant vigilance. Yet he took comfort in the idea that one life could indeed redirect the arc of a polity if that life committed itself persistently to reform and reflection. His earthly demise felt less like an extinction than a passing of a torch. His memory lingered in the stone inscriptions and the hospitals, and the planted trees and repaired wells. Generations later, people would tell tales of an emperor who had learned to weigh the balance between the strength to rule and the courage to be tender. Those tales would become part of the moral education of later ages, a whisper that power can be an instrument of care rather than merely control. The idea of compassion as a public virtue had consequences beyond any single nation. It provided a template for rulers elsewhere to imagine policies that prioritized life and dignity. The story of his transformation invited others to consider the ethical grounding of their own decisions, making moral imagination contagious. In that sense, his legacy was not only administrative but catalytic, seeding conversations about ethics and governance across regions. When historians and poets later attempted to distill his life into lessons, they often returned to the central paradox he embodied, that the capacity to command great violence can, if deeply scrutinized, become the capacity to prevent it. His life argued that moral awakening does not negate responsibility, rather, it reorients responsibility toward the alleviation of suffering. That argument remained compelling because it asked rulers to be more than efficient, to be wise and tender as well. For those who knew him personally, the memory of quiet kindness was the most authentic testament to his change. It was found in small, repeated gestures, the distribution of food to an ailing village, the patient listening to a querulous old man, the gentle insistence that his children learn humility. These quotidian acts, repeated over time, created a texture of life that spoke louder than proclamations. His story continues to travel in the imaginations of people who wrestle with power and conscience. It serves as a reminder that moral change is possible but never easy, requiring continual practice, institutional support, and a willingness to confront one's past harms. That reminder still matters because the dilemmas he faced, war and peace, extraction and sustainability, authority and mercy, are perennial. In listening to his life, we are invited to consider our own small spheres of influence and the ways we might practice compassion in them. The shift he made was not magic but the product of reflection, accountability, and persistent action. Those conditions remain available to anyone who chooses to take responsibility for the suffering in their own communities. Time, in the end, became his most honest judge and his most forgiving witness. He could not erase every injury caused by human ambition, but he could and did alter the tenor of statecraft in ways that reduced harm and built resilience. That sustained effort is perhaps the clearest lesson his life offers, that awakening is not a single moment but a lifelong engagement with the question of how to be both strong and kind. The empire he shaped bore traces of his ethic long after his death, and laws, and rituals, and the stories parents whispered to their children. Those traces show that moral vision can be infrastructural, not merely decorative, shaping daily life and expectations. To those who would listen, that lesson speaks to the possibility of building societies in which compassion is as practical as it is noble. And so his life becomes an extended parable for rulers and citizens alike, an exemplar of what humility paired with authority can accomplish. His awakening teaches that accountability and remorse can be engines of reform rather than endless remorse. That teaching echoes across centuries because it is rooted in a simple, stubborn truth that power guided by conscience can transform the world in concrete ways. In quiet moments, when the sun tipped low and the palace gardens exhaled their fragrances, he would sit and think about the shape of things he could not change and the ones he still might. He accepted limits and persisted where he could, a tension that would define the remainder of his life. Those evenings were not filled with fireworks, but with contemplative, steady attentions to the task of making life less bitter for as many as possible. Ultimately, his transformation reveals the surprising plasticity of the human heart. Even those reared in the language of force can learn the grammar of care. It stands as a testament to the power of reflection and the practical demands of compassion. For listeners now, it offers both a narrative and a challenge that every person who holds influence, however modest, can choose to cultivate policies and practices that lessen harm and uplift life. In the centuries since Ashoka's reign, thinkers have debated whether his model can be replicated in modern nation-states, given differences in scale, technology, and social complexity. While the contexts differ, the core question remains timeless. Can political authority be marshaled to promote moral ends without becoming coercive? Ashoka's answer was an emphatic yes tempered by pragmatism. His life suggests that while perfection is unattainable, persistent efforts to embed compassion within governance can yield real improvements. There is a moment when a life tilts so completely that the story you thought you knew becomes simply the prologue to something larger and stranger. Ashoka's life begins there, on the cusp of empire and conscience, where a prince from the Indian subcontinent became, in time, a ruler whose name would be remembered across centuries. Imagine a world of grand rivers and ancient cities, of merchants with wide-reaching caravans and soldiers who measured fate with the edge of a sword. Into that world a man was born, not merely to rule but to test the limits of power itself, and what he discovered would change how rulers would tell themselves stories for generations. Listen and let the details unfold like a long, low drumbeat, a steady cadence of battles and edicts, of pillars rising from stone and gentle changes in the governance of common life. The Maurya dynasty was the stage on which Ashoka played his part, but even before his own ascendancy, the dynasty's foundations had been laid by iron will and political shrewdness. Chandragupta, a name that precedes Ashoka, had forged a vast state through alliances and conquest, and he left behind a machinery of rule that was both centralized and adaptive. This apparatus, with its intricate bureaucracy and appetite for order, became the training ground for Ashoka, who learned early to measure the pulse of an empire beyond his own ambitions. He watched how decisions made in palaces would ripple out through villages and markets, and he would later measure his moral compass against those ripples. Ashoka's youth is a study in contrasts, the intimate domesticities of royal life set against the cold calculus of ambition. Accounts suggest he was both capable and cunning, endowed with a charisma that drew men to him and a temperament that was not easily tamed. He served as a governor in various provinces, where he learned administrative detail and the complexity of local loyalties. There, among merchants and peasants and provincial officers, he tasted the practicalities of rule, the tax ledger, the local dispute, the weighting of military logistics, that would later shape his reforms. War, in Ashoka's early career, was not an abstract instrument, it was a reality of life and statecraft, and he embraced it with the fervor expected of a warrior prince. The Mauryan army was formidable, an organized instrument that had been used to expand borders and cement power across diverse peoples. Ashoka, who would later be remembered for his advocacy of nonviolence, first earned his stripes on the battlefield and in the councils of conquest, where the logic of statecraft demanded hard answers. It is essential to remember this, not to judge him from a single perspective, but to understand how the same man could command armies and later renounce bloodshed in policy. The campaign that changed everything for Ashoka was the war in Kalinga, a coastal region rich in trade and fiercely independent traditions. The accounts we have were told by many hands across centuries, but each returns to the same central image, a war that left a king confronted by the human cost of imperial ambition. Kalinga was not a small affair. It was a fight that tore through families and markets, through temples and fields, and brought such suffering that the echoes lingered in the capital and in Ashoka's own private reflections. In retelling these events, historians have sought both the military details and the emotional core, because it was the combination of tangible loss and inner reckoning that altered the course of his reign. When the reports of Kalinga's devastation reached him, Ashoka faced a kind of reckoning that a ruler seldom experiences in public and more rarely still in private. The images that tradition preserves are stark: columns of wounded, mothers grieving, fields left fallow, and a sovereign who saw this tableau as a mirror of his choices. From this rupture came a transformation that would be as much moral as practical, a recalibration of what it meant to govern. He did not become gentle by a whim. He arrived at a new philosophy by confronting the consequences of his earlier decisions. Buddhism, then one among many spiritual currents in the Indian subcontinent, found a powerful patron in Ashoka, but his relationship with it deserves careful inspection. He had been exposed to a variety of beliefs, including Brahmanical rituals and local cults, yet the principles of Buddhism, compassion, nonviolence, and a focus on ethical conduct, resonated with a man seeking to reconstruct his rule on a different foundation. Scholars debate the precise chronology of his conversion, but the core fact is that Buddhism offered a language and a set of practices through which Ashoka could reframe authority. He did not simply become a private adherent. He used his position to make ethical teachings a part of the public culture of governance. It is tempting to picture Ashoka as a monk king in simple robes, but the reality is more nuanced and administratively profound. He remained a sovereign with the responsibilities of territorial defense and economic stability, and he translated Buddhist ethical principles into the instruments of state. This translation produced what he called Dhamma, a term that in his edicts blends moral conduct, social harmony, and practical governance. Dhamma, in his usage, was not dogma. It was a pragmatic program to reduce suffering and increase mutual respect among his subjects. The vehicles Ashoka used to broadcast his Dhamma were as innovative as they were durable: stone pillars, rock edicts, and inscriptions carved into the very landscape of his empire. These monuments were not mere propaganda. They were public records meant for farmers, traders, soldiers, and pilgrims who would pass by them. Carved in clear, accessible language, they invited people into a conversation about how to live together with fewer conflicts and more compassion. The geographic spread of these edicts, from the edges of Bihar to the far reaches of what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, speaks to his ambition to make ethical governance visible and permanent. If you stand beneath an Ashokan pillar, you can hear centuries. Stone holds memory in a way that words alone cannot. Many of these pillars are crowned with animal capitals, lions, bulls, and elephants, that themselves became symbols, later incorporated into modern emblems. The craftsmanship is subtle and firm, each groove telling a story about artisans whose names are lost but whose skill has endured. More than monuments, these pillars were a dialogue between ruler and subjects, a set of reminders carved into the living geography of the land. Ashoka's edicts themselves range in tone and purpose. Some are practical, others introspective, and many combine both threads. He admonished officials to treat prisoners humanely, recommended medical treatment for people and animals, and urged that facilities be maintained for travelers and pilgrims. He wrote about respect for teachers and the importance of religious tolerance, urging citizens to avoid sectarian hatred. Yet there is also a personal voice in these inscriptions, a confession-like quality when he speaks of regret and the need for restraint. One of the most striking aspects of his project was the integration of welfare into statecraft in ways that anticipatorily resemble modern public policy. Ashoka was not merely pious in private. He instituted public works, planting trees, digging wells, and building rest houses that stood to benefit the poorest and the most itinerant. These actions reflect a ruler who saw the infrastructure of daily life as moral terrain. The state had a duty to heal the harms caused by its own expansion. In other words, Ashoka's piety translated into practical measures that touched everyday survival. He also created administrative offices dedicated to the propagation of Dhamma, appointing officers tasked with the moral education of the populace and monitoring the application of humane policies. These Dhamma Mahamantras were a curious invention, officials whose job was to spread ethical teachings and to ensure that governors and tax collectors did not stray into cruelty. It's a glimpse of a ruler who understood that laws and moral persuasion had to work in tandem, and that bureaucracy itself could be humanized. This approach troubled some traditionalists, but it also brought a consistency to governance that had previously relied more on force than on rule-guided compassion. Ashoka's idea of religious tolerance is often misunderstood as mere pluralism. It was deeper and more nuanced than that. He did not seek to erase difference, nor did he demand uniformity of worship. Rather, he promoted mutual respect and interreligious dialogue as necessities for social harmony. His edicts explicitly encouraged people to learn from one another's doctrines and to honor teachers across different faiths. This stance opens a window into an imperial mind that saw diversity not as a threat to be stamped out, but as a fabric to be woven carefully together. The spread of Buddhism beyond the Indian subcontinent owes much to Ashoka's patronage, although he did not seek to coerce conversion. He sent emissaries and missionaries to neighboring lands and beyond, including to present-day Sri Lanka and the Hellenistic kingdoms, and he supported the establishment of centers for learning where monks and laypeople could study. These early missions planted seeds that would grow into distinct Buddhist traditions across Asia. Consider, then, that Ashoka's influence extended not only through inscriptions on stone but also through networks of human travelers carrying ideas across deserts and seas. Art and architecture during and after Ashoka's reign underwent notable transformations, partly because he promoted Buddhist values but also because the empire's wealth and connections fostered artistic exchange. The Mauryan aesthetic favored heavy simplicity, broad forms, and polished stone that would later be adapted and elaborated by succeeding cultures. Ashokan patronage helped develop monasteries, stupas, and stupendously carved reliefs that functioned as visual sermons, teaching stories of the Buddha and of virtue to those who could not read. In cities and at pilgrimage sites, such art created a shared visual vocabulary that reinforced the moral messages in his edicts. Trade flourished under Ashoka's rule, and he recognized that prosperity and ethical rule were not opposed but complementary. The empire sat astride trade routes that linked the Indian Ocean with the interior plains, and these routes carried not only goods but cultural exchange and ideas. Ashoka's policies, which sought to reduce banditry and to improve roads and hospices, thus had the practical effect of boosting commerce and making travel safer. His understanding of economic policy was not purely mercantile, it was also an ethical stance that saw secure, fair trade as a means to social stability. Ashoka's reign prompts us to ask what it means for power to be legitimate, by moral persuasion, by example, or by force. He experimented with all three, moving from a paradigm of strict authority to a more persuasive form of rule that sought to win hearts as well as to command obedience. The philosophical underpinning was radical for his time in its emphasis on compassion as a tool of governance, yet it was also rooted in the harsh realities that had shown him the costs of unbridled conquest. That combination of idealism and pragmatic adaptation is what makes his story endlessly fascinating. The psychological dimension of Ashoka is an intriguing field of speculation, a warrior haunted by the faces of those he had made suffer, a ruler seeking solace in spiritual discipline, and a reformer trying to offset past violences through systematic benevolence. Whether he experienced a single, dramatic conversion or a gradual shift over years, his introspective statements suggest a man riven by moral anxiety and determined to atone. This inwardness did not make him weak, Rather, it gave him the perspective to enact policies that were innovative and, for many, humane. It's a rare convergence in history where personal transformation and public policy intersect with such clarity. We must also examine the contradictions that make Ashoka human and therefore sympathetic to us centuries later. He remained a monarch who managed wars on his borders and maintained an elaborate court. The ideal of nonviolence had boundaries when state security was at stake. Moreover, the application of Dhamma was not uniform. Some regions and officials interpreted his decrees differently, and local realities often complicated even the best-intentioned reforms. The result is not a picture of a saintly ruler whose every decree was perfectly implemented, but of a leader who strove to steer a vast, imperfect world toward less harm. Ashoka's family life, though less documented than his public works, offers glimpses into the human rhythms that shaped him. He had wives and children, and his extended household included advisors and courtiers who influenced decisions both personal and political. Stories of familial rivalries and courtly intrigues remind us that royal life combined intense intimacy with high-stakes power plays. These domestic details matter because they show how personal relationships could complicate public ideals and how familial loyalties might both support and undermine reforms. The end of Ashoka's direct lineage was as messy and human as his life. Succession disputes and the gradual unraveling of central authority after his death reveal how dependent his project was on a singular personality. Empires often hinge on the strength of an individual, and when that individual passes, the structures he created can wither if not institutionalized with resilient mechanisms. The Mauryan state's decline after Ashoka teaches a cautionary lesson about the fragility of reforms that are not fully embedded in lasting institutions. Yet even as political control faded, the moral and cultural contributions of his reign rippled outward for centuries. Ashoka's image in the centuries after his death took on almost mythic dimensions, and the layers of legend often mingle with fragments of historical record. Some accounts paint him as an enlightened sovereign, while others emphasize his earlier martial achievements, and the truth often rests, as it does in many biographies, between extremes. Over time, poets and storytellers amplified his virtues and sometimes softened his faults, turning him into a repository for ideals people wished to see in leadership. This mythologizing was not an accident. Later rulers and communities reused Ashoka's story to legitimate their own projects or critique others. Archaeology and epigraphy have played central roles in separating the man from the myth. The discovery of rock edicts and carved pillars in widely dispersed locations provided first-hand testimony to his policies. These tangible artifacts became benchmarks for historians trying to reconstruct the chronology and motives of his reign. Inscriptions offer a direct voice, albeit one shaped by the conventions of the time, and they allow us to compare narrative traditions with documentary evidence. The dialogue between inscription and story is where much of the modern understanding of Ashoka has been forged. Modern scholars have debated endlessly about the details of his life, and those debates are themselves instructive about how we interpret the past. Some historians emphasize his role as a Buddhist convert who spread the faith, while others highlight his administrative genius or his pragmatic concerns about empire. There are arguments about chronology, about the precise nature of his conversions, and about the extent to which his policies were novel or derivative. These debates, while technical at times, reflect a broader human desire to make sense of a figure who seems at once familiar and distant. The colonial period in South Asia introduced a new layer of interpretation, one that often saw Ashoka through the lens of 19th-century European values and anxieties. British administrators and Orientalists sometimes celebrated him as a benevolent despot or as an example of enlightened monarchy, projecting their own ideals onto his record. Indian nationalists later reclaimed Ashoka as a symbol of unity and moral leadership, using his image in the struggle for self-rule. In both cases, historical memory becomes a tool of present concerns, and Ashoka's legacy is continually remade to suit contemporary needs. In independent India, Ashoka's imagery took on state-level significance, from the adoption of the lion capital as a national emblem to the incorporation of motifs from his reign into public architecture and education. The choice of Ashoka as a symbol was not accidental. It linked a modern political project with an ancient tradition of ethical governance, signaling continuity and aspiration. Schools and textbooks retold his story for generations of young people, and his edicts served as mediums through which civic virtues were taught. This modern embrace reintroduced him into everyday political discourse and gave his ancient project new life. Ashoka's influence on Buddhism is felt not only in the historical spread of the religion but in artistic and doctrinal developments across Asia. Missionaries who traveled under his patronage contributed to the establishment of monastic codes and scholastic institutions in far-off places. As Buddhism adapted to local cultures, in Sri Lanka, in Central Asia, and East Asia, the seed of Ashokan patronage often remained visible, not as a uniform orthodoxy but as an initial impetus. In this way, his reign acts as an early chapter in a long, transcontinental narrative of spiritual exchange. Reflection on Ashoka's language and choice of words in his edicts is revealing. He carefully balanced moral exhortation with concrete administrative instruction, and his rhetorical style aimed at persuasion rather than intimidation. He spoke of remorse and correction, of the happiness that comes from ethical living, and of the dangers of arrogance and hatred. The choice to use idioms and metaphors accessible to ordinary people shows a leader who wished to be understood beyond the court. It is an exercise in political communication that modern leaders could study with profit. The geography of Ashoka's realm also shaped his policies. He ruled over diverse climates and ethnicities, from the Gangetic plains to the coastal tracts and the fringes of mountainous territories. Governing such a varied landscape required flexibility and a capacity to recognize local customs, which his policy of religious tolerance sought to accommodate. Infrastructure projects, such as roads and wells, were tailored to specific environmental needs and thus reveal a ruler attentive to local contingencies. In short, Ashoka's governance succeeded where it listened to place as well as to ideology. Beyond the realm of politics and religion, Ashoka left impressions on daily life, the importance of animal welfare in his edicts, the attention to medical care, and the building of amenities for travelers all suggest a ruler who thought about the rhythms of ordinary survival. These measures improved the lives of the itinerant poor and traders, reducing the immediate suffering that arises from neglect. His concern for animal health, striking in its specificity, reminds us that his ethics extended into realms often ignored by policymakers. Such concerns make his reign less abstract and more palpably humane. To understand Ashoka fully, we must also scrutinize what his use of power cost him personally. To lead ethically in such a stratified society demanded compromises and enemies. Not all members of the court welcomed his changes, and factions arose that either mourned the old order or tried to manipulate the new one. Internal dissent and regional resistance were constant pressures that tempered his reforms and forced compromises. The presence of such friction makes his achievements more remarkable. He worked not in a vacuum of consensus, but in the messy reality of competing interests. Artisans and laborers under Ashoka's patronage also played an unheralded role in shaping his legacy. Stonecutters who polished pillars, stonemasons who hewed rock edicts, and sculptors who gave animal capitals their proud faces contributed materially to a visual program that outlived political vicissitudes. Their craftsmanship encoded messages in ways language alone could not, and their anonymous hands connected the lofty aims of a distant sovereign to the tactile realities of a common life. Remembering them is to acknowledge that history is made by many hands, often unnamed, whose work gives permanence to ideas. The archaeological record of Ashoka's projects continues to surprise and inform modern scholars. Newly discovered inscriptions refine dating and show the administrative reach of his decrees. Excavations at sites thought to be marginal have revealed robust connections and trade that complicate earlier assumptions about the limits of the Mauryan economy. Each artifact is a piece of a broader puzzle that, when placed, shifts our understanding of how connected that ancient world really was. The steady accrual of such finds keeps Ashoka's story an active field of inquiry rather than a closed book. The ethical aspects of Ashoka's leadership also raise philosophical questions about the limits of state responsibility in alleviating suffering. When a ruler attempts to legislate compassion, what mechanisms ensure sincerity and avoid performative acts? Ashoka anticipated some of these challenges by pairing moral exhortations with public works and administrative oversight, yet even his system could not guarantee perfect implementation. The debates his reign engendered continue to echo in modern political theory about the role of governments in nurturing moral behavior. When you listen to an edict, you sense Ashoka's voice across the centuries, sometimes admonishing, sometimes mournful, often instructive. He writes about hate and the mind's capacity to nurture ill will, urging mindfulness and restraint as actable disciplines. It's a rhetoric that sometimes reads more as counseling than command, as if the sovereign were addressing his people not from above but alongside them. That intimacy between ruler and ruled is one of the most striking features of his inscriptions. The influence of Ashoka extends into literature and the arts, where poets, playwrights, and filmmakers have returned repeatedly to his life as a source of moral drama. Novels reimagine his internal debates, films stage the grand contrasts between war and peace, playwrights explore the tensions between public duty and private conscience. Each adaptation chooses different aspects to emphasize, revealing as much about the era of production as about Ashoka himself. In this way, his story has become a mirror in which societies view their own anxieties and aspirations. Comparative studies place Ashoka alongside other historical figures who reshaped moral politics, and these juxtapositions help highlight both shared dilemmas and unique responses. Like Constantine or Constantine's later Christianization of the Roman Empire, Ashoka used religion to unify and reform, but he did so with a distinctly ethical rather than doctrinal emphasis. Comparisons to prophetic rulers in other cultures illuminate how moral authority can be married to political machinery for reform. Yet Ashoka's insistence on nonviolence as a governing principle remains especially notable in the global historical landscape. Modern political leaders have sometimes invoked Ashoka as a precedent for ethical governance, and the invocation is telling. To claim Ashoka's legacy is to claim a moral intention in politics, but it is also to claim the burden of implementation. Leaders who invoke him inherit the challenge he posed, to transform abstract virtue into concrete institutions that reduce suffering and foster mutual respect. The invocation is aspirational, and it occasionally serves as a critique when modern governance falls short. Education in the Ashokan era also receives attention in his edicts, where he stresses the role of teachers and the transmission of ethical knowledge. He urged support for learned men and for the training of priests and monks, but he also recognized that moral education needed to reach laypeople beyond monastic walls. This attention to pedagogy indicates a ruler who thought about the long-term cultivation of character and civic virtue, not merely immediate compliance. Education, for him, was a civic good bound to the health of the polity. As monuments wither and languages shift, translation becomes a crucial element in the chain of memory that preserves Ashoka for later ages. Translators of his edicts faced the challenge of rendering ancient idioms into contemporary understanding, a task that requires both linguistic skill and cultural sensitivity. Each translation colors the reception of his statements, highlighting some facets and obscuring others. The ongoing scholarly work of translation keeps the conversation about meaning and intent alive across generations. The archaeological conservation of Ashokan pillars and inscriptions is itself a story of dedication, diplomacy, and debate. Preserving these artifacts requires collaboration between governments, scholars, and local communities who live near ancient sites. Decisions about restoration versus preservation, about where to display and how to interpret, reflect contemporary values as much as they do ancient histories. In this way, Ashoka's material legacy becomes a site of living cultural stewardship. Ashoka's attention to ecology and landscape management, as seen in his tree planting initiatives and attention to waterworks, suggests a proto-environmental consciousness rarely associated with ancient rulers. He understood that an empire's prosperity depended on sustainable practices and the maintenance of natural resources. While not environmentalist in our modern sense, his policies acknowledged the interdependence between human communities and their ecosystems. These measures were practical, moral, and foresight in equal measure. One of the more poignant features of his legacy is the way Ashoka addressed the plight of prisoners and defeated foes. He recommended tempering punishment with rehabilitation and mercy. This early approach to criminal justice emphasizes restoration over retribution and hints at a sophisticated understanding of social psychology. Ashoka's directives on the humane treatment of captives were radical for their time and yet resonate with contemporary discussions about justice reform. They remind us that mercy as a principle of governance has deep historical roots. The dissemination of Ashokan ideas beyond his reign was neither automatic nor linear. It depended on the labor of monks, merchants, and regional elites who translated teachings into local idioms. In some places, Ashokan-sponsored Buddhist institutions became centers of learning and charity that survived long after the Mauryan state declined. In other regions, his memory dimmed until resurrected by later political movements looking for historical legitimacy. The uneven transmission of his legacy shows how cultural memory can be both resilient and fragile. The historical sources about Ashoka include not only inscriptions but also later chronicles, such as the Buddhist texts that narrate his conversion and deeds. These later sources are invaluable for their narrative richness but must be read with caution, since they often fold in myth and moralizing intent. By cross-referencing these traditions with the hard evidence of epigraphy and archaeology, historians reconstruct a picture that honors both story and fact. This method of triangulation is essential to understand a figure so deeply enmeshed in both history and legend. Modern imaging and analytical techniques have opened new windows into Ashokan inscriptions, revealing details of carving techniques, pigment traces, and even faint marks of erased writing. Such technologies allow us to track changes in the stone over millennia and to detect efforts at later recarving or restoration. The interplay between ancient craftsmen and modern scientists yields a dialogue where each discovery reframes earlier assumptions. In this way, technology becomes a partner in the ongoing conversation with the past. Ashoka's moral experiment raises a compelling question: can a state systematically cultivate virtue without coercion? He believed in persuasion backed by social improvements, and his mixed approach acknowledges the limits of both law and exhortation. By pairing ethical education with tangible services, he attempted to create conditions where virtue could flourish without being enforced by terror. The result is a model of governance that combines carrots and moral suasion rather than relying solely on sticks. The private reflections Ashoka occasionally included in his edicts are arresting for their candid tone. They speak of remorse and corrective intention in a way that few rulers have dared to express publicly. This willingness to confess error and to seek rectification marks a kind of political humility that is rare and historically significant. It suggests a leader who understood moral credibility as an asset to govern effectively, not as a sentimental addendum. Such humility changed the texture of royal authority and offered a new template for moral leadership. Regional variations in the implementation of Ashoka's policies make clear that centralized ideals meet local realities with varying degrees of harmony. Some provinces eagerly adopted Dhamma and hosted thriving monastic communities, while others resisted, either clinging to older customs or interpreting his decrees differently. These local responses provide a nuanced view of empire as a network of negotiations rather than a monolith. The resulting tapestry shows how imperial visions must bend to regional particularities to take root. The study of Ashoka also forces us to think about how memory is curated, which stories are preserved and which are forgotten, and how are public images manufactured. The reuse of his symbols by later dynasties and governments is itself an act of historical selection. Emblems, coins, and inscriptions are repurposed to fit new narratives, and in that process the meaning of Ashoka's legacy shifts. Memory, therefore, is not static, it is a dialogue between past intentions and present needs. Even the language of his edicts, concise, direct, and occasionally poetic, reflects an understanding of communication that transcends time. He used stories and similes to convey complex moral truths in ways that could reach illiterate or partially literate audiences. The rhetorical strategies embedded in his writings show a leader who respected the intelligence of ordinary people and sought to engage them in moral reasoning. This trust in public capacity for understanding underscores an egalitarian impulse at the heart of his governance. Ashoka's concern for interregional relations, including diplomatic contacts with Hellenistic rulers to the west, positions his reign within a broader international context. He did not operate in isolation but in a world of exchange where ideas, goods, and envoys crossed borders. These contacts provided channels through which Buddhism and other cultural influences flowed outward and inward, enriching both Ashokan India and its neighbors. In this light, his reign emerges not as inward-looking but as node in a vibrant network of ancient globalization. Ashoka opened doors between worlds instead of building walls. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what inspires you more, his courage to reach beyond borders or his vision of peace that connected people far apart.